people, I feel better. Oh, Mrs. People, I feel sadder.
This is a fascinating book, Speaking While Female. The two people in there were very prophetic, two of the people that you wrote about. Rachel Carson had the unmitigating gall of questioning the use of DDT. And they thought she was a nut. Well, within 10 years, we found out that DDT was poisonous not only to birds, we found out it was poisonous to people, and people were dying of strange cancers who were being exposed to DDT. And yet they called her a nut. There was other words, but I'll let Donna use those words. And then there was another woman who, Claire Boothe Luce. She predicted that the Soviets would take over Eastern Europe. She was right. So some of these women were prophetic in their predictions, and they turned out to be correct. She'll talk about those. And I have to confess to you, about a third, maybe 40% of these people who are in the book, I've never heard of. And most of you who know me, I'm a student of American history. I never heard of these people. And now, many of them I had. And I thought, how in the world did she find that person? Well, that's what she does. She looks for voices of women, particularly, and unfortunately, there's a lot of voices out there that never got recorded. And she found some of these speeches in the oddest places. I looked where you found them. I said, where did she find that? So you don't have to go look for them. All you got to do is listen to her tonight and go buy her book. And we have some for sale in the back. It's my honor to introduce Donna Rubin, and the author of Speaking While Female.
What a nice introduction. Thank you so much, Tom Keener. Thank you to everybody in Allen, the community of Allen, the Allen Public Library. I'm so happy to be here, and just so you're not confused, I am a Dallas girl. I only live in New York now, but Dallas is my second home. So I'm really happy to be here with all of you and talk about my favorite subject, my passion, my obsession, the history of women's speech. Let me make sure this clicker works. Oh, good. Okay. This is my third act. I was a journalist for a long time. I was a newspaper writer and magazine writer and did some TV production. And then I became, in my second act, I entered my second act, which was speechwriter. I wrote speeches for corporate leaders mostly. I did write a little bit for Dan Rather and for Martha Stewart. Those are the two famous people that I wrote for. And also a little bit for the police chief in New York City. So I had a lot of varied experiences. But now I'm in my third act. And that is, I call it advocate. I'm an advocate for women's speech. And what it means is that I research the history of women's speech. I also am a speech coach, so I help people speak better and stronger and more powerfully and more persuasively. But I also lead workshops for companies and teach their employees how to use their voices, how to self-advocate, how to speak in public, how to become brand ambassadors for their companies, and role models for all the other women coming up the pipeline. So now I'm an advocate of women's voice, and the secret history of women's speech is my favorite topic because I really do feel like I've uncovered something that is secret, that really hasn't been known. I'm going to talk for a few minutes, kind of introductory about what I've learned about women's voice and women's speech in history, and then I'll talk about quickly about three women who are featured in my book. Tom mentioned, two of me mentioned Rachel Carson and Claire Boothe Luce, but I'm going to talk about three other women. And then hopefully you'll have some questions and we can talk about anything you like about women's speech, about American history and who spoke in history, and about the book. So when we talk about oratory or public speech in America, I'm going to stand over here so I can see the slides. This is generally what we think of, right? We think about men, powerful men in history. Give me liberty or give me death. Does anybody know who said that? I heard somebody. Patrick Henry, right. So we see the men and their wigs and their positions of power. I mean, that's the mental image that conjures up when we talk about speech. This is where it all comes from. This is Cicero. But of course, the tradition of public oratory goes back to the Romans and the Greeks, when the idea of speaking in public in the forum or in the assembly was associated with virtue or being a virtuous male. It was associated specifically with male behavior and leadership. And really, there weren't women who were speaking in public at that time. With a few exceptions, but generally, public speaking was for the guys. Okay, quick test. Can anybody think of a quote that this gentleman said in public? If you can, shout it out.
Give him hell.
Give him hell? No, I don't think it was Truman who said give him hell, right? Wrong guy. This is Winston Churchill, of course, probably the foremost hero, statesman and hero of World War II. But he also is a famous speaker, and his oratory is lauded. I see quotations from Winston Churchill all the time. He said, "We shall fight them on the beaches. We shall fight them on the landing fields. We shall fight them. Never surrender. Never, never, never surrender." I know I don't really sound like him, but he also said, "This was our finest hour." So everybody knows Winston Churchill was a great speaker. How about this guy? What did he say? 407 years ago. I didn't know that. If I were two-faced, why would I be wearing this one? That may have been, I'm not sure that's from a speech, maybe so, but I don't know that one. Anyway, he also said, "A house divided cannot stand, better angels of our nature." Although I think that's from the Bible. I'm pretty sure that's from the Bible. But anyway, everybody knows Abraham Lincoln was a great speaker. Generally, when I ask people who are the famous speakers in history, this is what they tell me. Frederick Douglass, Mahatma Gandhi, John F. Kennedy, and his brother, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King Jr., Ronald Reagan, who is known as the great communicator. Very seldom do they mention a woman. Very seldom. Once in a while, I'll hear Sojourner Truth, or maybe a Hillary Clinton, Michelle Obama, Oprah Winfrey, who are all in my book, by the way, all four of those women in my book, but that's about all. We cannot name women in history who were speakers because they're not in our history books. We don't study them, we don't learn about them, we don't quote them. It's as though they didn't exist. So that's the question I set out to answer. And what did I do? I did my research. I started looking at speech anthologies like this one. A treasury of great American speeches, our country's life and history in the words of its great men. Among the great masters of oratory, I am a bit of an obsessive and completionist, and so I started down this path of buying book anthologies, and in English, only in the English language, and I ended up buying about 230. And they're all over my living room. But I collected all the data. I went to the table of contents with a pencil and just wrote down how many speeches by men and how many speeches by women. And on my website, you can take a quick look and you can see at a glance that it's overwhelmingly men who are in these speech anthologies. A treasury of the world's greatest speeches. White House Handbook of Oratory. This is one of my favorites. It was published in 1899, and not only does it include speeches, but it also has poses for instructing men how to hold their bodies, how to stand for influence. One more. Malediction. But the point is that men had role models. I mean, the book is full of these images. Men had role models. They had instruction, but not the women. So that was the question. That was the question I started with. Where are all the women's speeches? Could it be that there really were no women speakers in history that merited inclusion in all these anthologies? So some of you may be familiar with this woman. Her name is Mary Beard. She is a classicist at Cambridge University in England. She's well known because she is on the BBC in a lot of history programs. You might have seen them on PBS about the ancient world, the Roman world, and she's pretty famous in England. But in any case, she wrote a book a few years ago called Women in Power, a Manifesto, in which she argued that women have been silenced in history. And in this picture, I included it because she's speaking, but behind her is a slide that she's talking about. It's at an angle, so it's a little bit hard to see, but it's a Greek image. I think it's from a vase. And on the left it's a picture from the Odysseus, which is the oldest work in Western literature, about more or less 3,000 years old. And you might remember Odysseus travels around the Mediterranean, and on the left is his son Telemachus, and on the right is his wife, Penelope. So Telemachus comes, in the first book of the Odyssey, Telemachus comes home and sees his mother, and Penelope comes downstairs and wants to speak. It's a room full of men, and she has something she wants to say, and Telemachus says, "Go away, no, this is not woman's place, this is for the men," so she does. And Mary Beard says this is the first time in Western history that a man told a woman, "Oh, do shut up, dear." It sounds better with her British accent. So this is the question I started with. Were women really silenced in history? Now, she's an eminent scholar, and I am not. So I respect her position, but I also want to push back a little because I've discovered through my research that women have not entirely been silenced. Every time there was a pressure or a movement to tell women to be quiet, women pushed back. It is undoubtedly true that in the professions, women could not vote, women could not be legislators, they couldn't be constitutional experts, they couldn't be on the pulpit. Until the 1850s, no major denomination, Christian denomination in America would allow a woman to preach from the pulpit. So overall, women were not encouraged to speak. In fact, women who did speak experienced severe criticism, opprobrium. I mean, they were really abused. They had cold water thrown into them. They had fruit and spitballs. Christabel Pankhurst, I was reading the other day, had a dead mouse thrown at her when she spoke. I mean, their reputations were dragged through the mud. They were called whores and prostitutes and even worse in the press, but still they spoke. They were criticized and calumnied, but still they spoke. So I did some research, and here's what I found. Postcards. Now, I happen to be a postcard collector. It's called Dilteology, postcard collecting. And I found a whole group of postcards from what's known as the golden age of postcards, which is about 1890 to 1910. And this is around the time that women all over the world were petitioning for suffrage. They wanted the vote, right? So in the United States, in Britain, in Germany, in the Netherlands, in Belgium, there were a bunch of postcards that were pro-suffrage, but there were also postcards like this one that were anti-suffrage. They were against the woman's vote, but how did they display it? They attacked women at their most powerful organ, essentially, their mouth. Dear Ruby, I wish I could tell you, but I can't because there's a padlock over my mouth. There's no end to a woman's tongue. I hate to tell you, I told you I was a completionist. I'm a little obsessive. I have about 200 of these images. I find them these postcards are on eBay, they're on Etsy, and they're on Amazon. And late at night, sometimes when I can't sleep, I troll those sites, and I find more and more of these disgusting images. This is one of my favorites. It's called the Viperine Tongue Lock. Viperine as in viper, meaning snake, and the woman has a tongue lock over her face. Now, the thing I find really offensive about these, I find everything about these postcards offensive, but here's what really rubs me. You can find these yourself. Try it later. You go on one of these sites that I mentioned and put in the search bar comic, postcard, and woman's lips, woman's mouth, woman's tongue, but use the word comic, and that's what you'll find. And I ask you, what is comic about this? These are images of torture, really. And I would bet there's no other group that you would show images like this about online and call them comic on one of those. I mean, you can find anything online, anything despicable online, but on Amazon and Etsy and eBay, I really object to that. Here's a disgusting one. A woman getting her tongue cut off. This is the last one, I promise you, but the reason I included this is because if you really like it, you can get it framed for $159.99, and you can even get a black satin finish frame for just a little bit. I mean, what is this doing online? To me, it speaks volumes about the misogyny, the prejudice against women speaking that hasn't gone away. So what did I do? I got mad, I got angry, and then I got busy. And I created this website. It's called speakingwhilefemale.co. It's called .co because I don't own the .com, but I think I'm going to be able to get it. I'm hoping I can get it from the woman who owns it. She hasn't agreed to give it to me yet. But speakingwhilefemale.co, and I just started throwing all the speeches that I could find that were in the public domain, and it now has thousands of speeches by women from around the world and across time. I've divided them into categories, and there's speeches on anti-slavery, abolition, on health and medicine, on temperance, on politics, on social issues. On all these different issues, you can find that women have been speaking through the ages, and you can find out what they said. In some categories, there are women's positions all over the map. Like in the category for suffrage, there were women who spoke against the women's vote, and of course, many more women who spoke for the women's vote. I mean, on every subject, there are different opinions, which is fine. I welcome all positions. I welcome healthy debate in society. I want all positions out there. I want everybody to be allowed to speak. But moreover, most of all, I want people to know that women have been speaking, that we have this tradition, and that I want all of us to feel empowered to use our voices too. So that's my overall goal. It's about the past, but it's also about the present and the future for our children and our children's children to grow up in a world where they know that women's voices are valued just as much as their male counterparts. So the first woman, I'm going to talk about three women. The first woman I want to talk about is Sarah Parker Remond. She grew up in a family, she was a black woman, and she grew up in a free black family in Massachusetts. And she and her brother became abolition speakers. And they traveled around New England speaking about slavery and the evils of slavery. This was about in the late 1840s, 1850s. And then they traveled around Massachusetts and the Northeast. At the bottom here, you can see the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society. And then in 1859, she was sent across the ocean by the American Anti-Slavery Society to Manchester, England. Well, she actually was sent to the north of England, which at the time was very wealthy because they had the cotton trade, the linen trade, all of the industry that they had in the north that was built on the Industrial Revolution. The north of England was flourishing, and it was flourishing because of primarily the cotton trade, which was built on the labor of enslaved people in America. So this is Manchester. Manchester was so wealthy, its nickname was Cottonopolis. And I'm just showing you these pictures so you can see what a wealthy city it was. But here's an image of, you can see these people in the foreground on the left. They're kind of tourists. But in the background, this is Manchester. You can see all the smokestacks. There were, I think in 1850, I just read the other day, there were like 109 textile mills and spinning facilities, mills and furnaces, all dedicated to the cotton trade and the linen trade. There were big docks in Liverpool that were just for cotton, the cotton trade. This is from Manchester. Cotton is king. And here you can see on the right, this gentleman, he's a representation of John Bull, and John Bull is a representation of, he's England, and he's squishing or sitting on an enslaved person. Cotton is king. So obviously it's a satirical picture. That is the Cotton Exchange. And that's the place where Sarah Parker Remond spoke in 1859. Now imagine this, she's a black woman, she's speaking to primarily a white audience, an upper class white audience, and she's explaining to them why they are complicit, why in all their prosperity and all the wealth that their society has, why they should feel guilty because they are complicit in the American slave trade. And I'll just read you one quick quote. She says, I walk through the streets of Manchester. When I walk through the streets of Manchester and meet load after load of cotton, I think of those 80,000 cotton plantations on which was grown the 125 millions of dollars worth of cotton which supply your market. And I remember that not 1 cent of that money has ever reached the hands of the laborers. So she talks about, and goes on to talk about what it was like for enslaved people in the South. So she really put the squeeze on them, right? And in fact, during the Civil War, of course, this was 1859, the American Civil War broke out in 1861. England was kind of on the fence about whether it should support the North or the South. There was a lot of pressure for them to support the Confederate States because of the cotton trade. But in the end, Abraham Lincoln was very involved in the pressure, and a lot of other people putting pressure on them not to do that. And in the end, England remained neutral throughout the Civil War. So I like to think that Sarah Parker Remond had some role to play in that. But certainly she was pricking the conscience of those people, of her audience, and that was a very brave thing to do. There she is. She has kind of a Spanish shawl mantilla around her head. She went on to become a doctor. She never went back to live in the United States. She studied medicine in Italy, and she's buried in the Catholic cemetery in Rome, and one day I'm going to go there and see her grave. And I'm going to, supposedly it's written on her grave site that she was a great speaker and abolitionist, and I always think I wish it would say great women speaker too. Okay, the next woman I want to talk about, surely you've heard about, that's Eleanor Roosevelt. She's also in my book. How could she not be? I have a few pictures of her life. I have such a fan of Eleanor Roosevelt. This is her at age 14. Of course, she came from a very patrician family. She was a Roosevelt. And she married her cousin. They were both very patrician, very upper class. And the way she looks in this picture was the way she pretty much was. She was quite shy and quite a quiet person. And there she was with her mother-in-law. That's not a very good picture, but I included it because, as many of you probably know, her mother-in-law, Sarah Delano, was very domineering. And I think it's no secret that as their years went on, their marriage, hers and her husband's marriage, Franklin Roosevelt's marriage, they became more and more distant. They began living separate lives. And she's credited, it's interesting, he was also, like Churchill, a hero of World War II, but I think in recent years, like in the last 20 years or so, there's been a number of biographies of Eleanor Roosevelt that have elevated her position in the public mind. There was one by Doris Kearns Goodwin, I think it was called No Ordinary Life, but a number of them. Another one came out just recently, and the historians say that they credit her with pushing him towards positions, social positions, for civil rights, for black rights, for recognizing people who didn't have rights in society, for social programs. You know, it was his position as president, his responsibility, you could say, to give speeches about unity, especially after the war started, about national unity and sacrifice for war. But she stood up and she said, how can you expect black people in America to sacrifice when they don't have basic rights? I mean, she really was very outspoken about issues that were controversial. We forget now how controversial, how divisive she was, and it was precisely because she took this very open stand for a number of issues, but specifically for racial issues. She befriended a number of black people, black individuals, and she made certain that the press was there to photograph her with them, and people were outraged. It's hard to believe, but people were outraged that she was friendly. She was friendly with, there she is in the middle, and I think that might be Mary McLeod Bethune, the great education leader from Florida. She was the one who was responsible for Marian Anderson speaking at the Lincoln Memorial when the Daughters of the American Confederacy wouldn't allow her to sing at Constitutional Hall. That was in 1939. So she's forever associated with that great civil rights stand. And there she is. I mean, she really took a stand. She even had imagine this, she even had some kind of a tea party for a group of little black girls on the lawn of the White House. It's so great that she would do that. And the press covered it. And a lot of people didn't like it. Probably the most important thing that she did in the global sphere was her work on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That was after the war, and of course her husband was dead by then. It was 1948, and she was the chairman of the committee that drafted this Declaration of Human Rights that forever stands and puts into law, puts into words and enshrines into law, and it was accepted by nations around the world that it is a crime to commit atrocities, to commit, crimes against human rights. And that document is really a legacy and a testament to her beliefs and her values. And so I included that picture. It was a hard call for me. I almost included the speech that she gave about this, which is also very famous. But in the end, I decided to include a different speech I'll tell you about. Let me just see what the next picture is. I love that picture of her. She went to Chicago in 1940. This is before the war. And she gave a speech to the Chicago Civil Liberties Committee. And she talked, of course, there was no war. There was no reason for anybody to have to feel like they couldn't talk, because of the war. After the war started, of course, during wartime, there's things you can't say, right? Because they could compromise the war effort. But she said, this is not a wartime. There's no reason why we shouldn't have free speech. And she said, I believe that this must apply to all groups, the same rights to all forms of thoughts, to all forms of expression, the same liberties. Otherwise, you practically deny the fact that you trust the people to choose for themselves in a majority what is right and what is wise. And when you do that, you deny the possibility of having a democracy. You have got to be able to listen, to allow people to state any point of view they may have or say anything they may believe, and then trust that when everyone has had his say, when there has been free discussion and really free, uninfluenced expression in the press, in the end, the majority of people will have the wisdom to decide what is right. So I admire her for taking that stand. She was criticized for it, but she was very principled. And also in that speech, she talks about poor people, people whose rights were trampled upon, and she's specifically referring to black people also. So she's one of my heroes. It's a beautiful portrait of her. Oh, also, before I get to Miss Hepburn, one thing about Eleanor Roosevelt, she really defined being a first lady in a new way. She was the first first lady to have a monthly column in a magazine, a weekly column in a newspaper, and a daily column. My mother remembers during the war, during the World's Fair in 40, I can't remember the year. Anyway, and during the World's Fair in New York, she would have a daily radio program where she'd go to the fair and be on the radio and talk about something that she saw at the fair that day. So she was vocal and visible in a way that no other First Lady had been before that. Okay, last woman, Katharine Hepburn, one of my favorites. And the speech that I included by her in this book has never been published before. In 1947, she gave a speech at a Progressive Party rally in Los Angeles. That was during the McCarthy era, when there was a lot of, there were hearings in Washington, D.C., but there was a lot of pressure from legislators against the left, against artists, against writers, against playwrights, against actors, because of their supposed communist ties. Of course, this was the Cold War, and she and her artistic friends were outraged, and she went to this rally, which was in support of Henry Wallace, who was the Progressive Party candidate for president. Of course, his candidacy went nowhere. In 1948, he wasn't on the ballot, but she spoke at this rally in 1947, and really it's an anti-McCarthy speech. She talks about the use of insinuation and the charges that were leveled against artists for no other reason than that they were for free speech and they were producing art that challenged the public and challenged the public to think differently. So anyway, she comes from, I should say by way of background, she came from a very outspoken family, you might say, a family where her mother was an associate of Margaret Sanger and actually testified before Congress for birth control. And when the great Emmeline Pankhurst, the British suffragette, came and delivered her speech, her most famous speech, Freedom or Death, in Hartford, she stayed with the Hepburns, the Hepburn family. They lived in West Hartford, Connecticut. So her family, she was one of these artistic families with all kinds of people at the dinner table, artists and writers all the time. So she grew up in a really, an artistic environment, I guess you'd say. This was one of her early roles. That's Little Women. Oh, I went too fast. That's a glamour shot. I love that one. And here, let me see if I can play this for you. This is a bit of audio from the speech that's in my book.
Tested the futile anti-labor legislation just passed by the Congress. And where do these men stand in the fight for peace? To achieve peace and lasting prosperity, there must be unity among us and among all the nations of the world. The same unity that won the war.
Well, anyway, let me read you an excerpt from that speech. By the way, she showed up at that speech in a flaming red gown. I don't know what she was thinking because, of course, the press called it her communist red gown. She says, "To be sure, there are communists in America. There are a few people in America who believe the free enterprise system has run its course. As I have made clear here today, I share no such belief. But to attack each new development in progress of American democracy as communism is to dig the grave of government of the people, by the people, for the people." And the reason I played that excerpt is because I just wanted you to hear her very patrician voice. She had that very famous lilt. So here's a question I want to leave you with. What does a powerful woman speaker look like? Well, she looks like all of us, everybody in the audience today, and we can include the men as honorary members today, because, as I said, this is about each of us. I want each of us here today to feel that we can put our voices into the public world. Now, whether that's a school board meeting here in Allen, Texas, whether it's a city council meeting, whether it's at a conference or for work in your workplace, whether it's writing a letter to the editor, whatever form it takes, I believe that your opinion is valuable and your words are valuable. And for women especially, I believe that when you speak up in public, you're serving as a role model for other women and for next generations. Because we have so many problems in this world. I mean, oh my gosh, we have governance problems, we have climate, you'd mentioned the environment. How are we going to solve all these problems if we don't have the best thinking and the best ideas? So I believe we should put all the ideas out there and let the best idea win. And if we don't have women in the conversation, if we don't have women's ideas and expertise and knowledge in the mix, we're not going to get the best ideas. I think you can tell I'm a bit of a zealot for this topic. So our voice matters and your voice matters. Thank you very much. That's all. I appreciate your listening.
We'll take questions from the audience. I'll start with the front. Donna, you want to have a seat so you don't have to stand? And this is the library. You can say what you want. Yeah, go ahead and sit. Jen, I'll get you in a minute. Let me check to see if there's any questions up here. But Jane, I'm going to let you be the conversation starter. Everybody's bashful about speaking up.
The one I just sat on. Hello.
I was curious because so many of the speeches that men make are probably written by women. Have you done any research on that? Because most famous men, as in your job, don't write their own speeches.
Well, that's an interesting question. That's an interesting question, and it's a good question to ask me because I'm a speechwriter, as you suggested. Actually, it's only true for relatively contemporary speakers that they have speechwriters, with one exception, one famous exception. But the first president of the United States to have a speechwriter was Warren Harding. So it wasn't until the Warren Harding's presidency that anybody filled that role. Whether somebody previously had other people, writing their speeches, I'm sure there were instances of that. Of course there were. And by the way, one of the most famous incidents in history is Aspasia. In ancient Greece, she supposedly wrote speeches for Pericles. But in general, I would say, in the past, most people did write their own speeches. And Lincoln is famous for writing his own speeches. I don't know that Churchill had a speechwriter. I don't think I ever heard that Churchill had a speechwriter. Now, we know Ted Sorensen wrote for John F. Kennedy. In modern times, yes. We know John Meacham today writes speeches for Joe Biden. But I would think that for most of history, these male speakers that you refer to, did not have speechwriters.
I did want to just share, I'm a fan of quotes, and Churchill had a lot of good ones, and one of his, but he also was very witty and did a lot of insults. So one of my favorites is, and he drank a lot too. So one woman came up to him the day and said, "Sir, you were drunk last night." And he said, "Yes, but today I am sober, and tomorrow you'll still be ugly."
I would have included that one, but I don't think it's from a speech.
I'm going to make two comments, two questions. One is, speaking of John Meacham, he has endorsed her book. And I'm curious, how did you pull that off? Because he doesn't give very many endorsements.
Well, I'm really glad you asked that question. I'm going to read what he said, and then I'll tell you. Then I'll answer your question. This is a vital book. By identifying and elevating the voices of women across the ages, Donna Rubin has successfully led all of us, remember those words, all of us, to examine our assumptions and to listen with new ears and open minds. Carefully curated, deftly edited, and brilliantly brought together, this is a collection that will not be silenced but heard. Well, the story with John Meacham and me, such as it is that about 3 years ago or so, he did a limited podcast series, and it was called It Was Said. You know what a limited podcast series is, where they do like just 6 or 10 episodes. And this was all about speeches, famous speeches in American history. And of course, I was listening to every one. They dropped, or they appeared on Wednesday morning, and I would wake up Wednesday morning and go to listen to it, and it was man after man after man. And I was so annoyed. And in the end, I think the tally was 7-3. He did 10. 7 men and 3 women. If I'm not mistaken, it might have been 6-4, but one of the women he chose was, and he would mention a speech, and the whole episode was dedicated to analyzing that speech and playing part of the speech. And one of them was Meghan McCain and her oration, her eulogy for her father, John McCain, which was a beautiful oration. I love that speech. She delivered it beautifully. But it was all about her father, all about John McCain and what a great leader he was and all the great things he did. It wasn't about Meghan McCain at all. So I wrote a column and I said, "Dear John Meacham, why I'm breaking up with you," like a Dear John letter. And I said what I just said about, all these men and Meghan McCain with an asterisk by her name. And I said, "But you're forgetting about," and then I listed all these women. So I sent it to his publicist, and the next day he got an email from John Meacham. So we had a little phone call, and we chatted, and he thanked me for pointing this out. And he said, "If I do another series, I'd like to have you edit it with me." But of course, he hasn't. But when he said, all forcing, whatever he said, all with new ears, I feel like he means that I included him. So that makes me happy. So when I wrote him and asked him for a blurb, he said, "Absolutely, I'd be happy to do that."
My late sister was graduated from high school in 1964, and my grandmother had a master's degree, my mother had a master's degree, and there was no question my sister was going to college. And when she graduated, I found out half her female friends, weren't going to college because their dads didn't think it was necessary. We're not talking about 1864, this is 1964. In fact, one of them had the unmitigating gall of saying, if she wants a husband, it's cheaper to send her down to the Naval Air Base than it is to send her to college. In other words, that's the only purpose of a woman going to school. But that was the thinking. And so I can't imagine the pushback women must have, if that was in 1964, I can't imagine the pushback women got before that time.
Yeah, well, thanks for that recollection. It's very true. Most people, I think, tend to live and experience life within their own lifespan. And most people don't really know that much about what happened before and don't think about the way things were before. And that's one of the objectives of this book, because it starts in 1637 in the Puritan era with Anne Hutchinson, who was banished from the Puritan colony because she spoke. She spoke in public. They kicked her out. And then it goes through every period in history, every major period, the Revolutionary War, the temperance movement, of course, the abolition, the Civil War, and then Reconstruction, and then the women's vote, World War I. Every period in history, women were speaking out. And when you realize that, what it took for those women to be outspoken and the price that they paid, but also the sense in which they helped shape the nation that we know, I think it really does change the way we understand and see American history.
Questions, comments, protests? Speak up, ladies. There you go.
Hi, Donna. You began by asking people to recognize some of the male faces and famous quotes from them. If you had do you have a favorite quote or two from the book that you've written that people should know more about?
Well, the question I get asked the most, almost every time I speak, I actually did a lot of speaking in March because it was Women's History Month. Every speech, somebody asks me, "What's your favorite? What's your favorite speech?" And I always say that I don't have a favorite because I do love them all. But also it's because I'm still adding speeches to the speech bank. I have this online speech bank, and I'm still digging out speeches and adding to the speech bank. And I really do feel like my favorite speech is the one I just discovered at 2:00 this morning and added to the speech bank. Because every time I find a new speech, it's really strange, but I suppose it's like any avocation, hobby or avocation. it may seem very narrow, but when you go down that little narrow path, it opens up and becomes very expansive. To me, it's a very rich world, the world of women's oratory. And every speech has a whole story associated with it, a whole world of associations, another chapter in history. So I don't have a favorite from this book. I have some favorite quotes, and I can read you one favorite quote that I have. But I don't like to talk about a favorite speech. So one of the earliest speeches I have is from 1781. And that is by an indigenous woman, a Cherokee woman named Nanyehi. Now, most people don't know, but the earliest women speakers in America were indigenous women. In many clans or tribes, indigenous tribes, they were matrilineal, which means that women had a lot of power, right? Power to confer titles and authority to their children. And women spoke. Women spoke at meetings, at assemblies, at community gatherings, and in treaty negotiations with the Anglo settlers. The Anglo settlers were coming in and, encroaching on the indigenous land, and they would have negotiations over territories. There'd be wars and battles, and they would have different kinds of, negotiated treaties over them. And so from when basically those indigenous women or indigenous people in general didn't have written language. They were had oral culture, but not a written culture, so we don't know what they said. It breaks my heart, but all those women spoke in public, and we will never know what they said. But during those treaty negotiations, there were Anglos who wrote down what they said, and that's the case with Nanyehi. And in the Library of Congress is a scrap of paper. I've seen a picture of it. It's yellowed and torn, but it includes the words of Nanyehi from a treaty negotiation in 1871 on the Holston River in what's now eastern Tennessee. So she was a Cherokee woman, and she had a lot of status, and they were engaged in this negotiation to end some battles. And she says, our cry is all for peace. Let it continue, because we are your mothers. This peace must last forever. Let your women sons be ours, and let our sons be yours. And I find that so beautiful, because she obviously had a vision that these two people could come together as one, the Anglos and the indigenous. And of course, it's very sad. It's bittersweet to know that did not, it's tragic really to know that didn't happen. And of course, the Cherokees were not allowed to stay in their native land, and they were forced during the Trail of Tears, they were forced to leave their land. And so many of them died along the way. So I find her words very sad and poignant, but powerful too, because she had a vision of harmony that her words are still powerful.
Questions, comments? It's okay to raise your hand. Hold on just a second. Let me back here and then.
Hi, I was just going to ask, of the women that you profile, do you find that one or maybe a couple stick out in your mind as being most vilified at that time? I mean, you obviously read these and just welcome what they're saying, but of the public opinion at that time, that maybe one or two suffered more for having spoken up, at least in terms of what was perceived about them, stated, or other consequences that you uncovered in your research?
Well, I have some stories about women who were treated abysmally because they spoke. I mean, basically almost all the early speakers suffered abuse. I mean, there's this, the famous Sojourner Truth. She was speaking one time. She was a black woman who was an itinerant preacher. She adopted the name Sojourner Truth because she was traveling and sojourning the truth. She traveled around the eastern seaboard and spoke. And, when she would speak, and other women, people associated public speech with men. And they would call them manly. They would say, "Are you a man?" or they would say she's speaking like a man. And one time someone called out and said, "Are you a man?" And the story goes that she took her blouse and ripped her blouse open. But one time, Fanny Wright was so abused. She spoke in this book. I have a speech by her in 1828. She was originally from Scotland, but she came to America because she admired the American Revolution and became an American citizen, which is why she's in the book. But she was abused. They had a term for her called Fanny Wrightism, which is like a term of opprobrium for women who would speak out. And there were cartoons that showed her as a duck or as a, she just experienced, one time she was speaking and the venue was lit by gas flames, and someone shut the gas off. So all the lights went out in the room. I told you about Christabel Pankhurst having that mouse thrown at her. I mean, all of these women suffered terrible abuse. I'll tell you one more story. Anna Dickinson was a famous orator during the Civil War. She spoke for several years. She spoke all across the country. I have 20 speeches by Anna Dickinson in my speech bank. But when she was a very gifted speaker. She was a Quaker and very gifted speaker from an early age. And when she was about 21, she spoke, it was 1860, I'm trying to remember, when was Lincoln, the second inaugural of Lincoln? What year was that? 1860?
April of 1865.
1865? So before that, she traveled all over the Connecticut and Rhode Island and Delaware speaking for, I guess it was the Republican Party, and they credited her with helping get Lincoln, the Republican Party, in power again. So she was invited to speak at the Capitol, and she speaks at the Capitol. She's 21 years old. They had all the legislators there, and she gives a speech for about an hour. Lincoln comes in after she'd been with Mrs. Mary Todd Lincoln, after she'd been speaking for about half an hour. They amble in and sit and listen, and she is criticizing the president, criticizing his conduct of the war, criticizing the cabinet, criticizing, because she was very opinionated, and he just sat there and listened. But the reason I mention it is because here she was 21 years old. She was a sensation, and I can tell you what she wore, but I haven't so far found a transcript of that speech. I mean, perhaps the biggest indignity is that people just didn't write down what women said. I mean, the way I think about it is like this. Suppose a woman's giving a speech. I mean, not in contemporary times, but like, let's say 1800s, a woman's giving a speech. Is there a stenographer there to write down what she says? Does somebody go and record what she says? Is there a journalist? Does the male editor of a newspaper send a journalist to cover the event? And if he does the journalist write down what she says? I mean, probably not. And if he doesn't write down what she says, it's not going to be in the paper the next day. She's not going to be quoted. And her speech is never going to end up in one of those anthologies that I mentioned. So it's like a vicious cycle. Nobody really cared what women had to say. And the biggest sign of disrespect is that they didn't record their words.
One of the most awesome things that I was in reading all these stories and speeches is the reality that these women were not allowed to have an education. They were self-taught, they wrote themselves, they used their minds to express their passions, their words, but they were not allowed to go probably past 6th grade. And then what the learnings were was how to take care of a house, how to knit, crochet, whatever, to go envision their passion to express themselves and to try to change the world.
Yeah, it's very true. It's very sobering to think that how much we take for granted. And one of the speeches in here is by Emma Willard in 1819, and she spoke to legislators in New York arguing for a female academy, for a Academy of Learning. She grew up in a family where education was respected, and her brothers were educated, but not her. And she wanted to go to Dartmouth, and she applied, but they wouldn't let her in because they didn't accept women. And so she appealed to the New York legislature for money to set up an academy, and they turned her down. But her speech is in the book, in which she argues for all the reasons why women should have education. But interestingly enough, she didn't include public speaking in her curriculum because she didn't believe that women should speak or have the vote. So it took time for all these ideas to be accepted.
But to follow up on that, as I read the book and realized that half of these people who were speaking were poorly educated, I had to have my dictionary out to see what the words meant that they were using.
Well, one thing I will say is that I really do believe, I think you can tell I'm a little bit enthusiastic about the topic, I really do believe that this book belongs in libraries across the country. And if any of you have friends or daughters or granddaughters, they should have the book. But I do really believe that if this book is in a library, even if no one takes it down off the shelf, if no one cracks the spine, if they just see the words "speaking while female," that sends a message to little girls that their voices matter. And when they grow up, that their voices matter as much as the little boys. So this really is an argument for getting the book into libraries, at high schools, and public libraries. So that's why I'm so grateful to the Allen Public Library. But there's all these libraries in Dallas that should have the book. And so I really do want to invite you all to help me in that campaign. If you know any librarians or you know any teachers, to help encourage them to buy the book so we can spread the word about the power of women's voice.
My great-great-grandmother, she and her husband, before the Civil War, they attended an event in their little community, and the community was probably maybe 20 to 30 families or less that were probably at the event. And she kept a diary, and she wrote in the diary that they attended an ad hominem. In your research of speeches or things of that nature, have you ever run across that phrase used in that way?
No, I mean, my understanding of ad hominem is a personal attack, right?
Yes, that's the only thing I've been able to, but she said they attended, and yeah.
I think maybe she was misusing it.
Yes, that's what so I'm intrigued by,
It's a curiosity.
Yes, it is.
I was hoping you were gonna tell me that you have among her papers a speech, and I was gonna ask you, oh, please give it to me.
Well, as a matter of fact, her great-great-grandmother wrote the only known surviving diary of immigrants from Kentucky that came in from the Daniel Boone Colony into Collin County. And this is the only surviving document we have of that travel. She was 16 years old, and you would have thought a graduate student was writing it.
Wow. Do you know, I don't know if you know this name, Betty Sue Flowers. She was my literature teacher at the University of Texas. She went on, she was a Victorianist. She studied taught the Victorian literature, but she went on to be the head of the LBJ Library in Austin. And I actually just got together with her for coffee a couple weeks ago, and she gave me a speech from her great-grandmother at an event in East Texas commemorating the Confederate war dead. And I put it in my speech bank with great joy.
Questions, comments, protests? Got to be one more. Still have some time on the television. Since no questions, I'll ask one more. Tell us a little bit more about Rachel Carson. When I saw the names they were throwing at her, it would have made me cry. But she ignored it.
Yeah, Rachel Carson was an amazing woman, and people call her a prophet. I want to find the speech that she wrote. I really looked at a lot of different speeches by her before I settled on this one. In fact, I picked a different speech, and a lot of these speeches I had to get permission to publish, and I went to her literary agent. She's long dead, but I went to the literary agent, Frances Collin, and got permission and paid for one speech, and then I changed my mind when I found this other speech by her, and I wrote back and I said, do you mind if I use this one instead? So the one I used, and she was very gracious, she said, no, of course, that's fine. It's called Of Man and the Stream of Time, and it was a commencement speech that she gave in 1962 at Scripps College in Claremont, and it is, the thing about Rachel Carson is she was really a poet. She wrote beautifully and evocatively of nature and of the relationship between nature and human beings. She wrote of human beings who live in the universe and how when we are poisoning the universe, we are poisoning ourselves. We are destroying ourselves. And in this commencement speech, she talks about that. She talks about geologic age and how the planet has evolved in geologic time, and how human beings have survived all these different ages, and now we're poised to destroy the planet and ourselves. And it actually makes me want to weep when I read it. Now, the other thing that's so heartbreaking about Rachel Carson is that she was very sick. She had cancer. She was famous, beloved, because she wrote 3 books. She was a marine biologist, and she wrote 3 books about the sea and oceanography before she turned her attention to DDT and pesticides. When she wrote about pesticides, and of course her famous book was Silent Spring, was first published in the New Yorker, and in 3 parts. And I just saw in the New Yorker last week that they've reprinted. Maybe they're going to reprint all 3 parts, but they reprinted the first part last week. I think it was 1962. And when it was published, I think it was January 1963, the chemical industry and the chemical industry, they attacked her savagely. They attacked her reputation. They attacked her studies as though she weren't a scientist. I mean, she was really a scientist. She did all the work. She did all the science. She had everything documented very fastidiously, but they attacked her savagely. And she also gave a speech another famous speech, in which she talked about consider the source. That's what she said. When you read what these chemical industries are saying, consider the source. Meaning they were self-interested when they were disputing her charges. So yeah, she's a wonderful, wonderful woman, a wonderful scientist, and a wonderful speaker.
And that's what amazed me about her. She was a scientist, but also a poet. I mean, her words just flowed like flowers.
Yeah, and she died, did I say this? She died of breast cancer.
Questions, comments, protests. Okay, finally.
What is a quote that's very inspiring that you think young women need to know?
Well, one of my favorite quotes is from a speech that's not in the book, but it was by Michelle Obama. And she delivered this speech at the 2016 Democratic National Convention. And it was at a time, of course, it was a political speech. Her husband was running for presidency, and it was a very bitter campaign. And she said, when they go low, we go high. When they go low, we go high. And I think that's a very beautiful sentiment. And it's hard to do in the heat of the moment. When people are going low, the temptation is to go low with them. But I personally take a lot of meaning from that and inspiration from that, and try to keep to the higher plane.
Yes. I just wanted to mention 2 books that I've read. One is by Maria Popova, and it is called Figuring. And she talks about the life of Rachel Carson and goes into quite a bit of detail about, her fight to preserve the environment and how she started the whole movement, that we see today about, saving the planet. And also another book that I have read, and it is by Sven Beckert, and it is called The Empire of Cotton. And it talks about the cotton industry. My goodness me, what a violent past. Talks about colonialism, taking land from the indigenous people, about the cotton trade. So those are two big books that I have recently read.
Thank you so much for that. I've heard of both of those authors. I've heard of Sven Berkitz. I don't know that much about him. I know the name. But Maria Popova, I'm a big fan of hers. I haven't read a lot of what she's written, but some of her columns. But she also, Maria Popova, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, she also has a very lyrical way of writing. She's a beautiful writer. And she wrote an exquisite piece about Maria Mitchell, the astronomer. And Maria Mitchell is in my book. She's another woman I admire greatly. She was the first female astronomer in the United States. So if you have that book, you said you have the book, take a look at what she wrote about Maria Mitchell. You look at that and I'll read about what she wrote about Rachel Carson.
I did read about Maria
Mitchell. Wasn't that beautiful?
In the book.
Questions?
Sorry. Also, she has, it's called the Margillion or something like this.
Marginalian,
her newsletter. And you can get, an email. And, you can read about her writing. And, she's amazing.
She's driven by curiosity. She takes an inquisitive mind and lets her mind roam. And whatever she writes about with a lot of style and grace and insight. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
One more question. Surely somebody's got a question. You sometimes have a question. Not tonight? There you go. Before she talks, she served our country in the United States Air Force?
Why aren't things changing? Why don't people learn and continue to evolve? Why are we stuck where we are?
Well, I mean, your question has so many different aspects that I can't address. I'm not qualified. Those are above my pay grade. But in terms of women speaking, we have made so much progress. And it brings me joy to see that. One of the lessons of history is that you look back and you realize how awful things were, and we're not there anymore. I mean, I don't think any women today in America would want to go back to 10 years ago before the Me Too movement. So we're making progress all the time. It's just that we're stuck in our own time period and we don't really see it. But a book like this or any historical endeavor is so valuable because it forces you to look at the past and see the way things were. And also I can tell you, because I do a lot of coaching, and so I can see that as younger cohorts of women come up, they are bolder and they are more outspoken and they do use their voices. They do have more confidence. So they're not growing up with the same encumbrances that previous generations did. So I share some your concerns or grief about the fact that humanity seems stuck in a lot of ways. I really do see evidence that we are making tremendous progress, especially around women's rights, women's consciousness, women's opportunities. I see great change. And so in that respect, this book is really a celebration of that progress.
One more thing, and that is that John Meacham, he also has a podcast, and the one about history, and they're like 5-minute podcasts, and very interesting, his insight into different events and different things that have happened in history over the years. It's just 5 minutes. So.
He's very talented. I heard him speak here in Dallas. When was it? A few months ago at the World Affairs Council about his new book on Lincoln, which I would love to read. I haven't read it. Has anybody here read that book on Lincoln? Yeah, he's a great writer, and also he's a great speaker. And he's a speechwriter. As you know, he writes speeches for Biden.
I misspoke a while ago. I thought you said the second inauguration of Lincoln, and if you might have said the second election of Lincoln. Second election of Lincoln was in November of 1864. The second inauguration was March of 1865. So I might have misunderstood the question.
So the problem I have is that the book spans all of American history, and I'm not an American historian. So a lot of the dates I stumble with. I'm getting better, but sometimes I make really bad mistakes, so people correct me.
And I'd like to reiterate that one of the early speeches in the book is a woman just speaks, and she's banished. They have to go to another state.
That's Anne Hutchinson, 1637.
We're talking what year?
1637.
So it covers from 1637 all the way till current. Nobody gets left out. There's one more question here. No, but you can tell me the question if you want.
I think I usually stop breathing when I use a microphone for some reason, but I wonder what you think about the new tactic of using, quote, rules of decorum to silence trans people and civil rights leaders and other people in Congress in several states lately. The most recent is Zoe Zephyr in Montana. Or maybe that's
I did read about that. I read about that in the New York Times today. I think it's kind of clear what I think, especially when I was talking about Eleanor Roosevelt. I think everybody's voice matters. Of course I don't agree with all the points of view in this book. Of course I don't agree with everybody. I have thousands of speeches in my speech bank. How could I agree? They're arguing with each other. I just believe that everybody should, in a democracy, I believe all our voices should be heard. I think we should have civil, respectful, gracious, we should have civil and respectful exchanges. And that's why I support debate. I'm a debate judge for high school debate in my area, because I like it when young kids learn how to debate civilly. They take an AF and a neg, an affirmative and a negative position, and they have to prepare both. So they have to learn that every argument has two sides, and that each side has its own merits. So that's what I would like to see for young people, is that they learn that. So obviously I'm not for silencing anybody. You guys have been a great audience. Thank you.
Two more comments. The book is the first time ever. Now, other speeches have been assembled by women. This is the first time where she gives a brilliant analysis of how that speech affected American history. Is that wrong, or is that right?
You can be my publicist. I'll hire you. There have been a handful of anthologies of women's speeches. I would say there have been like 5 or 6. Mostly they don't do anything like I've done in the depth. They don't go into any depth about the history. And I would think that if there's any part of the book that I would just encourage you to look at or read, it's the introduction, where I really laid out the reason why I did the book, why I created the book, the rationale for it, which is basically all the speeches that have been lost throughout time and how important it is to preserve, what women say. So no, there hasn't been anybody who's done the kind of analysis that I presented in this book.
She's being modest. It was brilliant analysis. Donna Rubin, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.